I am Emma Carter, 27 years old. For as long as I can remember, my father always said I was too beautiful to be his daughter. He said my chestnut-brown hair and amber eyes were proof of my mother's betrayal. He insisted she had cheated. He treated me like living evidence of a crime my mother had never committed. Until the day he declared that he would only walk me down the aisle if I took a DNA test. In the end, I agreed. But the results didn't just prove he was wrong about the affair. They proved I wasn't his biological daughter, or my mother's. And what we discovered at the hospital where I was born made my father collapse to his knees in front of more than 50 relatives. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories about truth and family secrets, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. Leave your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Now let me take you back 6 weeks to the night my father gave his ultimatum. It was a Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Westport, Connecticut, a 5-bedroom colonial home my father loved to remind everyone he had built with his own 2 hands. The dining room gleamed with expensive walnut furniture and fine bone china my mother polished every week, as if perfection could somehow shield her from her husband's accusations. My grandmother, Eleanor, sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, watching my father like a hawk watching a snake. My brother Daniel, 30, the golden child of the family, kept his eyes fixed on his plate. My mother, Margaret, I clutched her napkin as if it were the last fragile piece of peace left. Then Richard Carter cleared his throat. "I won't be attending your wedding, Emma." The words landed like a grenade. My mother's fork hit her plate with a sharp clang. "Richard, please, not tonight," she whispered. But he had already pulled a folded paper from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table toward me. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," he said, his voice even, almost as if he'd rehearsed it. "I'm not walking another man's daughter down the aisle, not until this is settled once and for all." I looked down at the paper. It was a consent form for a paternity DNA test from a local clinic. His name was already signed at the bottom. "You have 6 weeks," he went on. "Take the test, make the results public to the whole family. If you're my biological daughter, I'll come. I'll even apologize." He smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "But we both know what the results will say." My grandmother's teacup struck its saucer with a cold, sharp click. My mother started crying. Silent tears ran down her face. And I just sat there, staring at the Omega watch gleaming on my father's wrist beneath the chandelier, thinking, 27 years. He had been waiting for this moment for 27 years. I didn't sign that night. I didn't storm out in anger either. I just said, "Thanks for the reminder, Dad. I'll remember this." And I meant it. I should explain that dinner didn't surprise me at all. By 27, I understood too well that my father's cruelty followed a pattern, steady as the tide, only twice as relentless. I was 7 the first time I realized I was different. I had pressed my ear against my parents' bedroom door after hearing my mother cry, and I heard him hiss, "Look at that girl, brown hair, bright eyes. Who does she look like, Margaret? Certainly not me." At 11, I wanted to join the dance club at school. My father refused to sign the permission slip. "I don't invest in another man's child," he said, right in front of my brother. While in that same week, Daniel got a brand new guitar. At 18, Daniel went to New York University. My father paid for everything: tuition, dorm, living expenses. But when I got into interior design school, he looked at me across that same dining table and said, "Let your real father pay for that." So I took out loans. I worked 2 jobs. I graduated 6 years later with a mountain of debt and a degree I had earned entirely on my own. The worst part wasn't the money or the lost opportunities. It was watching my mother being worn down day by his accusations. Every fight, every disagreement, from electric bills to vacations to Daniel's career, somehow it all circled back to me. I was his weapon, his proof, his living reminder of the betrayal he believed was real. The night before I left for college, my grandmother pulled me aside. "Keep every paper from the hospital where you were born," she said, gripping my wrist tightly. "Your birth certificate, your records, anything. I have a feeling we may need them someday." I didn't understand at the time, but I kept them. 17 years later, I found out exactly why she had said that. That night, I drove back to my apartment in New Haven, a tiny one-bedroom place filled mostly with secondhand furniture, but it was all the result of my own stubborn determination. Lucas was sitting on the sofa waiting for me, his laptop open to some project designs. 2 glasses of wine were already poured. He knew immediately that something was wrong. What did he do this time? I told him about the DNA consent form, the ultimatum, the 6-week deadline. Lucas's jaw tightened with every word. "Maybe you should just do it," he said finally. "Take the test. Prove him wrong once and for all. Shut him up." I set my wine glass down. It was a cheap one from a discount store, nothing like the crystal my father loved to display. I looked at the ring on my finger. Lucas had designed it himself based on a sketch I'd once doodled years ago. "Pris, this isn't about proving him wrong anymore," I said. "It's about freeing Mom." Lucas fell silent. He knew the story I was about to bring up. 4 years earlier, I had gotten a call from my grandmother at 2 a.m. She had found my mother in the bathroom with an empty blister pack of sleeping pills. The paramedics got there in time, but only just. Since then, my mother had been on antidepressants, in therapy, trying to piece herself back together one fragment at a time. My father had never apologized. He had never even acknowledged that his 23 years of accusations had pushed her to the edge. He just kept insisting he was right. Mom gave him 34 years of loyalty, I told Lucas. And he repaid her with 27 years of calling her a liar. I opened my phone and pulled up the independent genetics lab I had quietly researched long before this. TrueMap Genetics, independent, fully accredited, and most importantly, completely unconnected to my father. "I'm taking the test," I said, "but I'm doing it my way." 2 weeks later, my father turned 59. The party was held at a private coastal club in Norwalk, a room overlooking the water with more than 30 relatives gathered to celebrate the man who had turned my mother's marriage into a prison. I wore a simple black dress. Lucas squeezed my hand as we walked in and whispered, "Just 2 hours. We can survive 2 hours." We couldn't. Halfway through dinner, after 3 glasses of red wine, my father stood up to make a speech. He thanked everyone for coming, and he praised Daniel for his successful career in finance. He raised his glass to my mother for her patience. Then his eyes landed on me. "Ah, my daughter is here too," he said, dragging out the word daughter as though it belonged in quotation marks. A few relatives laughed awkwardly. I hope she's been giving serious thought to our conversation about proving where she really comes from. The room went dead silent. "Dad," Daniel said, half rising from his chair. "Maybe this isn't the time." My father waved him off. "No, this is exactly the time. Families should be honest with each other." He looked at me with that familiar cold smile. "Do you know what bird lays its egg in another bird's nest? A cuckoo. The egg may look beautiful, but it doesn't belong there." It never did. Someone behind me gasped. Someone else let out a quiet, uncomfortable laugh. My mother stared down at her lap, tears falling onto the bracelet my father had once bought her as an apology after one of their worst fights. I set down my fork and stood up. Every eye turned to me. "Thanks for the reminder, Dad," I said evenly. "I'll remember this." Then I turned to my mother. "Mom, do you want to step outside for some air?" She took my hand. We walked out of that room, past the whispers, past the staircase, past the man who had spent 27 years trying to destroy both of us. But I wasn't done. Not even close. My grandmother hurried after us into the parking lot, her heels clicking on the asphalt like gunfire. "Emma, wait!" I turned. Eleanor, 76 years old, still standing like a queen, her eyes as sharp as blades. She had never liked my father. "That man thinks he's the center of the universe," she had once told my mother before the wedding. "But really, he's just a small man with a giant ego." Now she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Urgency. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, glancing behind us as if afraid my father might follow. "Something I should have told you years ago." She led us to a bench overlooking the lawn. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. Her voice dropped. "The night you were born, something very strange happened at St. Anne Hospital." I felt my mother go rigid beside me. "When the nurse brought you out for us to see, your grandfather was still alive then, and both of us were there, but that nurse looked terrified. Her hands were shaking, She handed the baby to your mother too quickly, then practically ran out of the room. Mom, my mother whispered, why didn't you ever tell me? Because I tried to investigate, my grandmother said. I called the hospital, I asked questions, but they shut me down. They told me everything was normal, that the records were sealed for privacy. She reached into her purse and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, but I managed to copy part of the birth record before they locked everything away. I looked at the paper, time of birth, 10:41 p.m. My mother said slowly, that's wrong, you were born at 10:52. I remember exactly. The doctor even joked that you almost shared Aunt Claire's birthday. 11 minutes. Something had happened in those 11 minutes. There's a name, my grandmother said. The supervising nurse on duty that night, Linda Shaw. She retired 8 years ago. I have her address. The next morning, I walked into the TrueMap office in Hartford with 3 DNA samples. Mine was easy, a sealed cheek swab tube. My mother's was voluntary. She had given it to me the night before, tears in her eyes, but her hands completely steady. No matter what the results say, she told me, you are still my daughter. Nothing will ever change that. My father's sample, on the other hand, I had taken in secret. A few strands of hair from the brush he kept in the guest bathroom, the same bathroom I had passed through at every holiday for years, pretending I didn't notice the way he stiffened whenever I came too close. At TrueMap, a calm technician named Dr. Patel explained the process. 3 weeks for results. Legally admissible if necessary, fully confidential. I paid extra for rush processing. That afternoon, I tried calling Linda Shaw, and the phone rang 6 times before someone answered. An older woman's voice, slightly shaky. Hello? Ms. Shaw, my name is Emma Carter. I was born at St. Anne Hospital on April 8, 1998. I believe you were on duty that night and I can't help you. The answer came too fast, too panicked. Miss Shaw, please, I only need to ask. I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't contact me again. Click. I stared at my phone for a long time. Lucas looked up from his work table. Well? She hung up. I set the phone down carefully, but not before panicking. Lucas, she knows something. I'm sure of it. 3 days later, the email arrived. Not privately, of course. My father wasn't subtle enough for that. He sent it to the entire extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins, people I hadn't seen in years. 43 recipients. My mother, and my grandmother and I were all copied on it. The subject line read, regarding Emma's wedding. I read it in my car, parked outside the hospital where I worked, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Dear family, as many of you know, I have carried a burden for 27 years. I have always suspected the truth about my daughter's parentage, and I have watched my wife refuse to admit it. I asked Emma to take a DNA test and make the results public before her wedding. So far, she has refused, and I believe that says everything. Until this matter is publicly resolved, I will not be attending the ceremony. I hope you all understand my position. Attached is a family photo from Emma's baby celebration. I invite you to look closely and draw your own conclusions. For Richard Carter, the attached photo was one I remembered from my grandmother's mantle. I was 3 months old, in my mother's arms, brown-haired, bright-eyed, pale-skinned, surrounded by my father, Daniel, and a family full of darker features. My father had circled my face in red and added the caption, "Spot the outsider." Within hours, the responses started pouring in. Some people defended my mother. Most just asked careful, probing, curious questions. That night, Daniel called me. "Just do what Dad wants," he said, his voice tight. "You're making this worse. You're damaging his reputation." I actually laughed. "His reputation? That's what you're worried about?" He hung up without answering. 3 weeks after I submitted the samples, the email from TrueMap arrived at 9:14 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Lucas was away in Providence for work. I was alone in the apartment, half a salad still sitting on the coffee table, the TV on, but unwatched. The subject line was clinical. Your DNA analysis results. Secure document. I entered my password, verified my identity, opened the PDF, then read it 3 times. Because the first 2 times, the words simply didn't make sense. Subject A, Emma Carter, shows a 0% genetic match with Subject B, Richard Carter. I had expected that. I had prepared for that. I had even braced myself for the possibility that my father was right about one thing, even if he had been wrong about everything else. But then came the second line. Subject A, Emma Carter, shows a 0% genetic match with subject C, Margaret Carter. I stopped breathing. 0%. Not my father's daughter. Not my mother's daughter either. I called TrueMap's after-hours number. My voice breaking as I demanded to speak to anyone who could explain what I was seeing. The technician walked me through it step by step. No contamination, no lab error, no possibility of a mix-up in the testing. The samples were clean. The science was conclusive. I had no biological relationship to either of the two people I had always called my parents. That meant one thing. My mother had never cheated. My father had been wrong about that for 27 years. But it also meant something else, something almost impossible. If my mother hadn't cheated, if she had been innocent all along as she always claimed, then why wasn't I her daughter? I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet, my phone in my lap, staring up at the ceiling. For 27 years, my father had called my mother a cheater. And for 27 years, he had been wrong about an affair that never happened, but he had been right about one thing. I wasn't his daughter. The question was, whose daughter was I? The next morning, I drove to my parents' house, timing it for 10 o'clock. Late enough that my father would be out playing tennis. Early enough that my mother would still be sitting out back drinking tea. She looked up when she saw me and immediately looked worried. "Emma, what's wrong?" I sat down across from her and handed her my phone, the TrueMap report still on the screen. I watched her read it. Watched the color drain from her face. Watched her lips move as she reread the numbers again and again. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wild. "This is wrong," she whispered. "It has to be wrong. I called the lab. They checked everything. There's no mistake. But I gave birth to you." Her voice shattered. "I was in labor for 14 hours. I felt you come out of my body. I saw you, Emma. But you were red and screaming and mine." I took her hands. They were freezing. "I believe you," I said. "And if that's true, then there's only one possibility." She stared at me. "Something happened at the hospital. Someone switched us." The silence between us tightened like wire. "The time," my mother said suddenly. "The certificate says 10:41, but I remember 10:52. I kept looking at the clock because the pain was unbearable. I always wondered about that discrepancy. 11 minutes. Those 11 minutes had rewritten the fate of two families. "Mom," I said carefully, "if I'm not your biological daughter, that means your real daughter is out there somewhere, 27 years old, living someone else's life." My mother broke down. Not the quiet crying my father had trained her to swallow. These were deep. The violent sobs pulled from somewhere primal. "We have to find her," she choked out. "We have to find both sides. I need to know." Let me pause here for a second. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family, like you were somehow the wrong piece in the wrong place just by existing, I know what that feels like. But this story wasn't over. The truth was about to become much more complicated. Now let me tell you about the nurse who finally broke her silence. My father found out about the DNA results before I could prepare. Daniel, as always, had seen the TrueMap email confirmation on my mother's phone while stopping by for lunch. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. My father's voice was triumphant from the very first hello. "Well, what did it say? Was I right?" I didn't answer. I didn't know how to explain that he had been right and catastrophically wrong at the same time. My silence was enough. "I knew it," he laughed. Really laughed. 27 years, Emma. 27 years I've been saying it and nobody believed me, but I was right. I was right all along. "Did you tell Grandma?" "Of course she knows. Your mother's probably crying right now, trying to invent another lie." I could hear him pacing, excitement spilling through the phone. "I'm sending another email to the family. This time with proof. You don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly. You're not my daughter. Your mother lied to me for nearly 30 years. And now everyone is going to know exactly what kind of woman she is." He hung up before I could tell him that my mother had never lied, that she had always told the truth, that the real story was something none of us had ever imagined. Within an hour, my father called my mother and told her to pack her things. "I want you out of the house by the end of the month," he said. "I'm sick of your lies." My grandmother drove over immediately to stay with her. When I arrived that afternoon, I found my mother curled up on the sofa like a wounded animal, and my grandmother standing in front of her like a silver-haired guard. "He thinks he's won," I said quietly. My grandmother looked at me with those razor-sharp eyes. "Then let's show him the rest of the story." The next 3 days were the hardest of my life. I even considered postponing the wedding, not because of my father, but because I couldn't bear the thought of my mother's vindication being swallowed beneath wedding dresses and champagne toasts. Lucas refused. "We are still getting married," he said, holding my face in both hands. "Absolutely, your father's issues are not our issues. We do not postpone our life because of his tantrum." But I couldn't move forward without the truth, and the truth was locked inside Linda Shaw's memory. I called her again and again, 5 times in 3 days. Every single call went to voicemail. On the 6th try, I left a different kind of message. "Ms. Shaw, this is Emma Carter. I know you remember that name. I now have legally admissible DNA evidence showing that a baby was switched at St. Anne Hospital on the night of April 8, 1998. I am not trying to blame you. I am not trying to sue you. I just need to know who I am." I took a breath. "If you don't call me back, my next call will be to a lawyer. I will subpoena hospital records. I will request a formal investigation, and whatever you've been hiding for 27 years will come out in the worst possible way." I waited 1 hour, 2 hours. At 4:03 p.m. my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Thursday, 2 p.m., Maple Diner, Bridgeport. Come alone." I stared at the message for a long time. Then I replied, "I'll be there." Whatever Linda Shaw had been carrying for 27 years, she was finally ready to put it down. The question was whether I was ready to hear it. Maple Diner was the kind of place time had forgotten. Cracked vinyl booths patched with tape, an old jukebox that only played old songs, coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since dawn. Linda Shaw sat in the corner booth, her back to the wall. She was 71, smaller than I had imagined, silver hair twisted into a tight bun, and both hands trembling around her coffee cup. She looked up when I slid into the seat across from her. "You look so much like her," she said quietly. "Your biological mother, Sarah Collins. Same hair, same eyes." My heart lurched. "You know who my biological mother is?" Linda closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, they were wet. "I've carried this for 27 years. Every day I asked myself whether keeping silent was the right thing, whether I should have spoken up that night." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. "This is my shift log from April 8, 1998. She opened it to a marked page and slid it toward me. I read her cramped handwriting, my blood going cold with every line. 10:41 p.m., baby girl number 1, born to Margaret Carter, healthy, 3.1 kilograms. 10:52 p.m., baby girl number 2, born to Sarah Collins, healthy, 2.9 kilograms. 11:26 p.m. Incident: trainee nurse Heather mixed up the 2 infants after bathing. 1:58 a.m. Error discovered. Both families had already held, fed, and named the babies. 2:20 a.m. Meeting with hospital administration. Decision made to alter records, not return the infants. Reason: less traumatic for the families. 2:40 a.m. All staff ordered to sign NDAs. I looked up, shaking. "They knew?" I whispered. "They knew that same night, and they covered it up?" "The administrator said switching them back would cause more pain," Linda said, her voice breaking. "I was 23. They threatened my license, my pension. I had 2 children of my own." "Who was the other baby?" She pulled out another sheet of paper, a printed social media profile. A woman about my age. Dark hair, brown eyes, and a smile that looked uncannily like Daniel's. "Her name is Olivia Collins," Linda said. "She's 27. She lives in Worcester, Massachusetts." Then she looked at me with eyes full of guilt. "And she is your mother's, and your father's, biological daughter." That night, the silence in my apartment didn't feel like silence at all. It felt loud. Not in sound, but in weight. Like the walls were holding their breath with me, like the air itself had thickened, pressing down on my chest just enough to remind me that something fundamental had shifted. and there was no going back to the version of my life that existed even a few days ago. My laptop sat open in front of me, and on the screen, Olivia Collins, a name that, until a few hours ago, meant absolutely nothing. Now it felt like it meant everything. I stared at her profile picture longer than I realized, long enough for the edges of her face to blur slightly from the moisture building in my eyes, long enough for my brain to stop processing her as a stranger and start recognizing her as something else, something closer, and something that shouldn't have been close. Dark brown hair, warm eyes, a soft, grounded smile. She looked calm. The kind of calm that comes from living a life that makes sense. The kind of calm I thought I had and before everything fractured. But there was something deeper, something I couldn't ignore. The shape of her jaw, the way her smile pulled slightly more on one side, the quiet intelligence in her eyes. It wasn't just resemblance. It was familiarity, the kind that doesn't come from coincidence, the kind that comes from blood. And suddenly, it hit me. Not as a thought, but as a feeling. A sharp, hollow, disorienting realization. She didn't just look familiar. She looked like she belonged where I had spent my entire life trying to belong. And I didn't. My chest tightened, because for the first time, I wasn't just questioning where I came from. I was questioning where I should have been. 2 babies, 11 minutes apart. 1 mistake, and 2 entire lives, rewritten. Every birthday I remembered, every argument, every moment I spent trying to prove myself to a man who never saw me as his own. All of it suddenly felt misplaced. Not wrong, not fake, but misplaced, like I had been living in a house built for someone else, and she had been living in mine. I didn't realize I was crying until a tear dropped onto the keyboard, then another, then another. I wiped them away quickly, almost reflexively, not because I wasn't allowed to cry, but because I didn't feel like I had the right to fall apart yet. Not until I knew the full truth. Not until I knew who I was. I looked back at the screen, at her name, at the life she had built. Teacher, volunteer, stable, grounded, normal. And something inside me twisted. Because she had lived her entire life thinking she belonged exactly where she was, just like I had. And now, I was about to take that certainty away from her, the same way mine had been taken from me. I opened a message window, and then I froze, because suddenly, this wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't just about answers. This was about impact, about consequences, about the moment someone's entire identity shifts, and nothing feels solid anymore. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed, "Hi, this might sound strange." Deleted. Too weak, too vague. Typed again. "I believe we were switched at birth." Deleted. Too direct, too brutal, too unbelievable. Again and again and again. Petty 17 times. 17 different attempts to say something that fundamentally cannot be said without breaking something. Every version felt wrong. Too soft, and it sounded insane. Too clear, and it sounded cruel. Too emotional, and it sounded unstable. Too logical, and it sounded cold. Because there is no correct way to tell someone their life might not be theirs. My hands started shaking slightly, not violently, just enough to remind me that this moment mattered, that this wasn't just a message. This was a point of no return. I closed my eyes, took a breath, and stripped everything back. No performance, no perfection, just truth, careful, honest, measured. I introduced myself. I explained the DNA test. I mentioned the nurse. I laid out the possibility without forcing it. And then I wrote the only sentence that felt real. You deserve to know the truth. Because that was the only thing I was absolutely certain of anymore. Not who I was, not where I belonged, not what family meant. Just that truth, no matter how late, still mattered. My finger hovered over the send button. And in that moment, time stretched. Because once I pressed it, there would be no undo. No version of life where I didn't know. No version of her life where she didn't question everything. I pressed send. The message disappeared, and something inside me shifted permanently. The next 24 hours didn't pass. They dragged, slow, heavy, uncomfortable. Every minute felt stretched thin. every second filled with anticipation that never quite resolved. I checked my phone constantly, not casually, not occasionally, obsessively, every vibration, every notification, every time the screen lit up. My heart jumped, then dropped because it wasn't her. I tried to distract myself, turned on the TV, didn't register a single word. Opened the fridge, closed it, sat down, stood up, walked in circles, because my body didn't know what to do with the waiting, because waiting is its own kind of torture, when what you're waiting for has the power to change everything. By the time night came, I felt hollow, not empty, just stretched too far emotionally, like I had been holding tension for too long and didn't know how to release it. I sat on the couch, phone in my hand, staring at nothing. And then it rang. Unknown number. My body went still, completely still, because in that moment, I knew. I answered. Hello? Silence. Then, a breath and a voice. Soft, unsteady. Is this Emma? Everything inside me tightened. Olivia? A pause, then a shaky exhale. My whole life, she said slowly. People told me I didn't look like my parents. Her voice wavered. My dad used to joke that maybe the hospital made a mistake. A small, broken laugh escaped her. I guess it wasn't a joke. I closed my eyes, because in that moment, there was no more doubt. Just truth, and the quiet devastation that comes with it. I'm so sorry, I whispered, and I meant it in every possible way. For what? She asked. For everything. We talked for 3 hours, and somewhere in those 3 hours, two strangers began to understand something impossible together. We compared stories, childhood details, parked small things that shouldn't matter but suddenly meant everything, moments that didn't fit, feelings that never made sense, questions we never had answers for, and slowly, piece by piece, the truth settled between us. Not violently, not dramatically, but quietly, like something that had always been there, waiting. By the end of the call, we both knew. We didn't need convincing, we needed confirmation, so we agreed. Another DNA test, her, compared to my parents. Results in 10 days, 10 days that would finalize the truth, or destroy what little certainty remained. The next week, I stopped being emotional and became precise, focused, strategic. Because this wasn't just about knowing anymore. This was about accountability. I built everything carefully, like a case, documents, DNA reports, and the nurse's statement, timeline, every detail aligned, every piece undeniable. Because this wasn't just for me, this was for my mother, for every year she had been accused, for every moment she had been doubted, for every tear she had swallowed, because no one, not even her husband, chose to believe her. My father wanted proof. He wanted it public. He made it public, so I would finish it the same way. Nathan watched me from across the room. You're sure? He asked quietly. Once you do this, you can't take it back. I didn't hesitate, because for the first time in my life, I didn't want to take anything back. No, I said, I won't. Because the truth had been buried for 27 years, and now it was finally going to be seen. Then let's give them a night they'll never forget. 3 days before the engagement party, Olivia's DNA results arrived. Subject A, Olivia Collins, shows a 99.97% match with Subject B, Richard Carter. Subject A, Olivia Collins, shows a 99.98% match with Subject C, Margaret Carter. I read those numbers 3 times, tears streaming down my face. Then I called Olivia. Can you meet me in person tomorrow? We chose a cafe halfway between New Haven and Worcester. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting in the corner with 2 untouched coffees. The moment she saw me, she stood so quickly she nearly knocked over her chair. For a long time, we just stared at each other. She had dark hair, brown eyes, a jawline unmistakably like Daniel's, and the same dimple in her left cheek my father had. And I had chestnut hair, bright eyes, a small nose, pale skin, exactly like the woman named Sarah I had never met. This is so strange, Olivia whispered. Then she laughed, and I laughed too. And suddenly we were hugging in the middle of that cafe, crying into each other's shoulders while the staff politely pretended not to notice. "I want to meet them," Olivia said when we finally sat down again. "Margaret and Richard, my biological parents." "You will," I promised. "In 3 days." I didn't tell her that one of them would end the night on his knees. The engagement party was held at my grandmother's Georgian estate, with rose gardens and strings of fairy lights hanging from century-old oaks. She had insisted on hosting. "That you deserve a proper celebration in a place where your father's ego can't reach." About 50 guests arrived that evening in cocktail attire. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, and every person who had received my father's accusatory email. I wore a deep navy dress and carried myself like someone who had already won. Lucas stayed close beside me, his hand resting lightly against my back. My mother arrived with my grandmother. Her eyes were still swollen from days of crying, but her back was straighter than I had seen in years. Something had changed in her after we learned the truth. A weight had lifted, even before the public vindication. Then my father arrived. Late, of course. He came in with that same effortless confidence, as if the room had gathered for his victory lap. A charcoal suit, his watch flashing under the lights, and a smirk at the edge of his mouth. He thought this night belonged to him. He had no idea. I watched him circle the room, shaking hands, accepting murmured sympathy from relatives who still believed his version. "Such a difficult situation," I heard one aunt whisper. "You've been so patient." Daniel stood beside him, uncomfortable but still there, like a loyal soldier. In the corner, Linda Shaw sat quietly with a glass of water, both hands still trembling. And in the adjoining room, beyond the side door, Olivia waited for her cue. I checked my phone. Lucas nodded. It was time. Halfway through the party, my father asked for a microphone. The room fell silent as he stepped onto the small platform my grandmother had prepared for speeches. He adjusted his jacket, cleared his throat, and smiled at the crowd like a king about to issue a decree. "First, let me congratulate Lucas," he said. "You're a brave man, marrying into such a complicated family." A few uneasy laughs. "But I think we all know why I'm really standing here." His gaze found mine. Something icy flashed in his eyes. "There's been a lot of talk lately, a lot of speculation. I asked Emma to take a DNA test, and I know she did. What I don't understand is why she's been hiding the results." The room went absolutely still. So I thought I'd help her out. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. My son was kind enough to share a copy with me. Daniel lowered his eyes. My father unfolded the pages with theatrical slowness. 0% match with Richard Carter. 0% match with Margaret Carter. Gasps rippled through the room. My mother gripped my grandmother's hand. "For 27 years," my father said, at his voice rising with vindicated fury, "I have said something wasn't right, and now science proves I was right. I was right from the very beginning." He turned toward my mother, his face twisted by nearly 3 decades of resentment. "You lied to me, Margaret. You lied to everyone. And now the whole family knows what kind of woman you really are." The silence afterward was suffocating. Then I started walking toward the stage. "You're right, Dad." My voice was calm as I climbed onto the platform and took the microphone from his hand. He was so stunned, he let me. "The DNA results show that I am not your biological daughter, and I am not Mom's biological daughter either." His smile widened. A few relatives exchanged looks that said we knew it, but not because Mom cheated. That smile froze. I turned to face the crowd, every single person who had received his email, every single person who had whispered about my mother. "Let me introduce you to someone." I nodded toward the side door. Olivia stepped through, 27 years old, dark hair, brown eyes, features so unmistakably Carter that the room practically reeled. The murmuring exploded. Someone dropped a champagne glass. Daniel made a strangled sound. "This is Olivia Collins," I said. "She was born exactly 11 minutes before me at St. Anne Hospital on the night of April 8, 1998. The night I was born, there was an incident. A trainee nurse accidentally switched 2 babies after bathing them, and the hospital covered it up to avoid a lawsuit." I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen. The large display I had arranged earlier lit up with the TrueMap reports. Olivia's DNA shows a 99.97% match to Richard Carter and a 99.98% match to Margaret Carter. I let the numbers settle over the room. She is your biological daughter, the daughter you've been searching for 27 years. And she has been living in Massachusetts her entire life because a hospital made a mistake and chose to bury it." My father's face went white. He looked at Olivia, really looked at her, and I watched 27 years of certainty collapse inside him. "This is Linda Shaw," I continued, as Linda slowly stood from the corner. "She was the supervising nurse that night. She has a notarized affidavit confirming everything I've just told you. The shift logs, the switch, the cover-up, all of it." Linda stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Mr. Carter, I was there. I saw it happen. Like your wife never betrayed you. Never. The hospital made us sign NDAs. They threatened our jobs, our pensions. I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." I turned back to my father, the man clinging to the edge of the platform like he was trying not to drown. "You wanted science. Here it is. You wanted paperwork. Here it is. You wanted truth. This is the truth. These are the 11 minutes that shattered 2 families for nearly 3 decades. Standing there on that platform with Olivia beside me, I felt something I had never felt in my life before. Vindication. Not for me, for my mother, for every tear she had swallowed, for every accusation she had endured, for every sleepless night she had spent loving a man who never once believed her. If this story is resonating with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the truth takes decades to surface. Now let me tell you what happened when my father finally understood what he had done. My father had spent 27 years being certain his wife had betrayed him, certain I was proof of that betrayal, certain that suspicion made him righteous, certain that cruelty was justified, certain that science would vindicate him. Now science had spoken, and it had destroyed every foundation he had built his life on. He looked at Olivia, the stranger who carried his face, his blood. He looked at the DNA results on the screen. He looked at Linda Shaw, whose trembling testimony had just demolished 27 years of accusation. Then his knees gave out. Richard Carter, proud, rigid, so certain, collapsed onto the platform like a puppet with its strings cut. He caught himself on one hand against the floorboards, breathing hard. I didn't know," he whispered. "How could I have known?" "You could have trusted her." My voice was quiet, but it carried across the room. "You could have investigated. You could have considered other explanations. Instead, you chose the worst one about the woman who loved you. But the hair, the eyes. Genetics are complicated. Recessive genes exist. Hospitals make mistakes. But you chose suspicion. You chose cruelty. For 27 years, you punished Mom and me for a crime that never happened." Across the room, a chair scraped back. Daniel stood. For a second, I thought he would go to my father's defense like always, but he didn't. He walked right past him without a glance and crossed to our mother. "Mom," his voice cracked. "I'm sorry. I should have said something years ago. I should have." My mother pulled him into her arms, and my father stayed on his knees, watching his family choose one another over him. For 27 years, my mother had lived in his shadow. She had endured accusations at breakfast, at dinner, and in every empty space between. She had cried herself to sleep more nights than anyone knew. She had swallowed his cruelty like poison, telling herself maybe one day he would finally see the truth. Now the truth was everywhere, in documents, on screens, in the face of a stranger carrying her blood. My mother stepped forward slowly, her heels clicked on the hardwood floor. The crowd parted for her. Even Daniel stepped aside. She stopped in front of my father, who was still kneeling, his face wet with tears. I had never seen him cry before. 27 years, Richard. Her voice was steadier than I had ever heard it. 27 years. I stayed because I loved you, because I believed one day you would trust me, because I thought this family was worth saving. He looked up. Margaret, She raised her hand and stopped him. No, not yet. You don't get to apologize yet. The room held its breath. You owe me an apology in front of every single person who received that email. You owe Emma an apology for every birthday you ruined, every graduation you ignored, every moment you made her feel like she didn't belong in her own family. Then she pointed toward Olivia, standing frozen near the door. And you owe Olivia an apology for not being the father she deserved. My father's shoulders shook. I didn't need the world to believe me. Richard. Her voice cracked on the last word. I needed you, and you never did." Then she turned her back on him and walked toward Olivia. "Hello," she said softly, tears pouring down her face. "I'm your mother. I'm so sorry it took so long to find you." It took my father 3 tries to stand up again. Daniel didn't help him. I didn't help him. No one in that room did. Not the same people who 10 minutes earlier had still believed him. He gripped the edge of the platform, hauled himself upright, and took the microphone back. His voice was almost unrecognizable, raw, broken, stripped of every ounce of arrogance I had ever known in him. I was wrong. 3 words, 27 years too late. I was wrong about Margaret. She never... His voice cracked. He swallowed and tried again. She never betrayed me. I accused her for nearly 3 decades, and I was wrong. Then he looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that wasn't suspicion. "Emma, I took things from you that I can never give back. Your childhood, your trust, money that should have been yours." He swallowed hard. "I'll pay off your student loans, all of them. It isn't enough, but it's a start." Then he turned to Olivia, the stranger who was his daughter, the child he had never held, never watched grow up. "I don't know what to say to you. You're my daughter, and I missed everything. Your first steps, your graduations, your whole life." His voice shattered. "That is something I will regret until the day I die." Olivia was crying too. We all were by then. But her voice stayed steady. "Then start now," she said. "Or if you really want to be a father instead of a judge." He nodded, unable to speak. My grandmother stepped forward and handed him a tissue from her purse. "Wipe your face, Richard," she said, not unkindly. "You've got a lot of work ahead of you." 1 week after the engagement party, I drove to Worcester. The house was small and white, with blue shutters and flower beds that had clearly been tended with love. Nothing like my grandmother's estate or my father's polished home, but warm in a way those places had never managed to be. Sarah Collins opened the door before I could knock. She was 55, brown hair streaked with silver. Amber eyes so much like mine it was startling. Looking at her felt like looking at myself 30 years in the future. "Emma." Her voice caught on my name. "I've been staring at your picture all week. I kept thinking I must be dreaming." She pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and sun-dried laundry. We sat in her kitchen for 4 hours. She showed me photographs of her childhood, pictures of my biological grandparents who had already passed away, as in images of the life I might have had if a trainee nurse hadn't made one devastating mistake. She told me about her ex-husband, Michael Collins, my biological father, who had died of cancer 3 years earlier, never knowing Olivia wasn't his. He used to joke that Olivia had eyes like she belonged somewhere else, Sarah said, wiping her tears with a dish towel. "Now I understand. They were your eyes, Emma. They were always your eyes." I showed her pictures of my own childhood too. The brown-haired baby in a family full of different features. The little girl who never quite fit. The woman who finally understood why. "I don't want to replace Margaret," Sarah said. "She raised you. She's your mother." "She is," I said, "but maybe there's room in my life for one more." Sarah's smile lit up the whole kitchen. "But I would love that." 2 months later, I married Lucas in my grandmother's rose garden, under fairy lights, surrounded by both families, the one I was born into and the one that raised me. My mother walked me down the aisle, not my father, my mother. She wore a champagne-colored dress, her head held high, her steps steady in a way I hadn't seen in years. I wore the wedding gown she and my grandmother had insisted on buying for me. "A proper wedding needs a gown worthy of it," my grandmother had declared. My father sat quietly in the second row, smaller, diminished. He didn't object when I told him he wouldn't be walking me down the aisle. He didn't argue when I told him that this was my mother's moment, not his. He just nodded and said, "I understand." It was a start. Aunt Olivia stood with my bridesmaids in a deep green dress that made her brown eyes glow. My mother's eyes, my father's eyes. She had been getting to know the Carters slowly in the weeks after the party. Tentative lunches, careful conversations. Relationships built one small brick at a time. Sarah sat in the front guest row, in a place of honor. When she caught me looking over, she waved, her eyes shining with tears. My grandmother stood to give a toast. "This wedding is not just about 2 people," she said. It is about two families finally finding their way back to the truth. It is about a daughter who refused to live with a lie, and a mother who waited 27 years to be believed. She looked at me, then at Olivia, then at my mother. To truth, she said, however long it takes. To truth, the room echoed. And I drank to that. And the lawsuit took 8 months. Olivia and I filed jointly against St. Anne Hospital, represented by a medical malpractice attorney my grandmother found, a woman with a thin smile and a very clear hatred of institutions that think they can bury their mistakes, Linda Shaw testified. Her affidavit was backed up by the original shift log she had hidden for 27 years. The hospital's lawyers tried to attack her credibility, pointing to her age, the NDA, the delayed disclosure. It didn't work. During discovery, internal documents surfaced, emails between administrators discussing the incident, memos about risk mitigation. A budget item renewed every year since 1998 labeled Contingent Liability Reserve. They knew, they had always known. And they had spent nearly 3 decades praying no one would ever find out. In the end, the hospital settled before trial. $400,000 to each family, $800,000 total, a public apology in the local paper, mandated improvements to infant identification procedures, and the public naming of the administrator who had ordered the cover-up, even though he had long since retired. "We are not suing for revenge," I told a reporter outside the courthouse. "We are suing so that no other family spends 27 years living a lie just because a hospital wanted to avoid responsibility for one night." Linda Shaw was granted immunity from personal liability in exchange for her cooperation. Later, she sent me a card in her shaky handwriting. "Thank you for giving me a reason to finally tell the truth. I can sleep now." I kept that card with my birth certificate, the real one, the one that said 10:52 p.m. At the one that told the truth. 6 months after the wedding, my father invited me to dinner, just the two of us. He chose a small Italian restaurant in downtown Hartford, not a country club, not somewhere glamorous, just a corner booth with checkered tablecloths, candles, and wine bottles lining the walls. He looked older than he had at the engagement party, grayer, smaller somehow, as if the weight of his confession had physically shrunk him. "I wanted to thank you," he said after we ordered, "for agreeing to meet me." "You're not my biological father," I said. "You never were. But you did raise me, even if you did it badly." He flinched, but nodded. "I'm in therapy," he said. "Your mother insisted." "Or strongly required?" I asked. He gave a weak laugh. "Something like that. We're doing couples therapy too. Now we were separated for a while, but we're trying to see whether anything is left to save." I thought of my mother, of how she had stood in front of him at the party, demanding the apology she had deserved for decades, of how much strength it must take to even consider rebuilding after everything he had done. "I remember when you taught me to ride a bike," I said. "I was 5. That was before you started deciding I wasn't yours. You ran behind me holding the seat for an hour until I could ride on my own." His eyes filled. "I remember. That was the father I needed," I said. "The one who held on. I'm willing to try, Dad, but you need to understand that forgiveness is a process, not a moment. And you still have a lot of work to do." He nodded. "I know, and I'll do it, however long it takes." I didn't forgive him that night, and I'm not even sure I've fully forgiven him now. But I gave him a chance my mother never got, the chance to prove he could change. Olivia and Daniel really met for the first time at a family dinner about a month after the wedding. At first it was awkward. How do you make small talk with the sibling you should have grown up with? Then Daniel mentioned he was allergic to shellfish. "Wait," Olivia said. "Me too, since I was little. The doctor said it might be genetic." "What about being left-handed?" Daniel asked. Olivia held up her left hand. "No way," Daniel actually laughed. "What about music? What bands do you like?" 30 minutes later, they had discovered they both loved the same obscure indie folk band. Both hated cilantro for no good reason, and both tapped their right foot when they were thinking. "This is weird," Daniel said, shaking his head. "You're like a mirror version, just, the female edition." "I was going to say shorter," Olivia shot back, tossing a piece of bread at him. And for the first time in my memory, there was real laughter at a Carter family dinner. Not the polite, strained kind my mother used to manufacture. Real laughter. The kind that comes when people are genuinely happy to be together. It was just a small moment, but it felt like the beginning of something new. 3 months after the wedding, my mother and Sarah met for lunch. I wasn't there, but my mother told me about it later, her voice full of quiet wonder. They chose a cafe halfway between their homes, the same way Olivia and I had once done. Sarah brought photos of Olivia's childhood. My mother brought photos of mine. They sat there for 3 hours, telling each other stories about daughters they had raised but not given birth to. She told me Olivia's first word, my mother said, and I told her yours. We cried a lot. Was it strange, I asked, meeting the woman who raised your biological daughter? My mother thought for a long time. I expected it to be, she admitted. I thought I'd feel jealous, resentful, but when I looked at her, all I could think was that she loved Olivia the same way I loved you. Completely, without conditions. She took my hand. We lost 27 years, but we got each other back, and we got the truth. That has to mean something. Now Sarah and my mother have lunch together once a month. They've become friends, a strange kind of friendship, born from loss and unexpected connection. They call each other the other mother, and in a strange way, where I think that's helping both of them heal. I'm sitting in our new apartment now, 2 bedrooms, in a nicer part of Hartford. Enough room for Lucas's home office and the nursery we're going to need sooner than expected. The walls are covered in photographs. My wedding day, with my mother on one side and Sarah on the other. Olivia and me at our first Thanksgiving together. My grandmother looking triumphant at her birthday last month. Lucas is in the kitchen making dinner, something complicated with too many ingredients. He's been on a cooking streak lately. I've been thinking a lot about the last year, about identity, about family, about what it means to belong somewhere. For 27 years, I tried to prove I was a Carter. I darkened my hair. I learned tennis because my father loved tennis. And I chose a stable profession instead of art because I thought it was the right kind of life, the kind a doubtful child should live if she wanted to be accepted. I spent my whole life trying to force myself into a shape that was never meant for me. Now I know I was never supposed to fit. I was another family's daughter, living another person's life, carrying another person's DNA. But here's what I've learned. DNA does not make a family. The woman who held my hand through nightmares, taught me to read, and stayed in a painful marriage just to keep our family intact. That is my mother. Not biology. Love. Lucas walks out of the kitchen carrying 2 plates and gives me a knowing smile. You're doing that thing again, he says. What thing? The staring into space while thinking too deeply thing. I laugh and take the plate from him. On the coffee table, beside a stack of baby name books and a pregnancy journal, is the test I took this morning. 2 pink lines. I don't know whose face this child will resemble more, mine, Lucas's, or some echo from both the family I was born into and the family that raised me. But I know one thing for certain. My child will be loved from the very first moment, without conditions, without doubt. That is the only proof that matters. If you're listening to this story, and you've ever been accused of something you didn't do, by a parent, by a partner, by anyone who should have trusted you, I want you to know that the truth has its own way of rising to the surface. Sometimes it takes 27 years. Sometimes it takes a DNA test and an old nurse haunted by her conscience. But it comes. Don't let someone else's suspicion define your worth. And if you are the one choosing doubt, ask yourself this. Is your certainty worth destroying the people you love? My father spent 27 years being certain. Certain my mother cheated. Certain I wasn't his. Certain his cruelty was justified. He was wrong about all of it. Trust is a choice. Doubt is easy. But 27 years of doubt can destroy a family. And 27 years of trust might have saved mine. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I'll see you in the next story. And remember, believe in the truth, even when it arrives very late.